Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, hello. I'm Daniel Pargman. I'm the host for this talk, and actually not only for this talk, because this is the first seminar in a series of seminars. We'll probably have 1, 2, 3 per month throughout the summer and autumn, games-related seminars here at Microsoft Research. And we're probably, for the most part, going to bring in people from other parts of Microsoft, but whenever there are guests passing by, we'll get hold of them and invite them. And so our first talk and our first guest is Dr. Talmadge Wright, who is Associate Professor of Sociology. He's a sociologist from Loyola University in Chicago, and he has been studying Counter-Strike players. And that's what his talk will be about. And I presume that quite a few in the audience might have heard of or even played the game. So,
how many people
welcome.
How many people have played it? Yeah, so most of you have played it. So good. This is great. You'll have lots of input from you then.
Sorry, I forgot. I have some handouts also. They won't be enough for all of you, but there are 50. So perhaps you could share if you sit beside someone you know. I'm also happy there are so many people here, because as you might know, there's the Research Faculty Summit. I think there would be even more people here if it wasn't for that. So could you please spread them in that direction?
Yeah, I think what I'm going to do is what I want to talk briefly about, first of all, since I come at this from the angle of a sociologist's perspective as opposed to media studies, right, or communications or computer engineering. And what I want to discuss briefly is just how I did this work and how I did the research, the methodological tools I used. Hopefully that won't be too boring. I'll try to keep it quick. The handout I gave you, the first handout, deals specifically with the methodology, so I'm not going to do a lot of description. You can read that for yourself. And then pretty much what we came up with in our initial observations and where I think we can go with this later on. So let me start out by just telling you a bit how I got involved in this project and why it evolved the way that it did. My own background in terms of my own research is doing homelessness, housing, urban sociology for 20 years. I published a lot in the field of poverty, inequality type issues, social justice issues, and also work on mass media marketing as well from a critical perspective. For me, the turning point came about really in 1999 when I got a new computer and bought the game Half-Life. All of you know about that. And I began to play Team Fortress Classic and Counter-Strike Online in that old dial-up mode that we all love and care about. And what I noticed was that people were chatting to each other in various forms in all kinds of ways, and that a lot of the chats were not connected to the game. Some were, some weren't. And I was, as a sociologist, my instinct pricked up and going, okay, what is this about? So that winter, I came back to Loyola University from California, where I was, and I talked to an anthropologist colleague of mine and one of my graduate students, and we formed a research team with computer science. And we said, okay, let's try to figure out what's going on here. So we began to develop a project that started out by by playing the game itself, at least 70 hours of play on 50 different servers around the country, recording the menus, right, when you sign up for the game, as well as the chat functions. And we did that because one of the computer science people, unbeknownst to me, because I'm not that literate around those issues, found the dump command that you could dump the chat files, right, into every 10 minutes you get a full chat system, right? We would download these chat files, 70 hours worth, and then we would go back and eliminate and strip out all of the material that wasn't connected to the talk. Except for the ones where the talk was connected to the action, we would leave that in. And we began to code that, as a sociologist would when you're looking at interview data or qualitative data, and ask the question, what's being said here? What's the significance of what's going on? So if you look at the second handout I gave you, what you'll see is a list there, I believe, is the typology of Counter-Strike Online FPS talk. And what we came up with was this elaborate codes that seemed to describe, in some way, the diversity of talk that was going on in these online games. And I think at that point, back in 2000, 2001, there was a lot of debate within the public realm about how playing shooter games is only about killing people and it's about making you, morally corrupt. And I mean, I think most of you know the debates around this. The media effects literature basically was full of a lot of, I would argue, flawed psychological studies that did not take seriously the perspective of the people who play the games, but rather had these assumptions about, often moral assumptions about what was good, what was evil, etc., about what happened. So I was interested as a sociologist, what do people actually do with this? How do they create a social world in the chats that they do? So we demonstrated this, and this was published in gamestudies.org. I think in 2002, I believe it was, we did our study, that looks at and talks about the fact that when you're discussing the online game, what you're looking at is a complex social world among all the players, which to most of us here who do gaming would be, well, duh, that's the case. But we have to understand that for the majority of people, they don't think that way about this. So I was trying to empirically demonstrate how this world exists and how it operates. So those categories are the ones we came up with, and those categories form the foundation then for the kinds of questions we were going to develop to do interviews with people who play games, who we played games with. So we developed another program as we hooked up with some people at a Midwestern campus, graduate students as well as undergraduates, that were playing Counter-Strike. I got invited to some sessions, so I began to, cook, after hours, in the university library, and then other students would go to the computer lab, and of course all this was discouraged by the administration because gaming is not thought of as something necessarily on university campuses that they want students to do, especially with office computers run by personnel and computers people are using to write their term papers on. But nonetheless, we did this, and so I tagged along as the insider. My colleague was an outsider, and by outsider I mean, I love him dearly, but he couldn't hit the broadside of a barn if it was in front of him. In terms of coordinating the mouse and the keyboard, it was very difficult. So he was good because he, as not being an insider, he could record the reactions of what people were doing who were actually playing the game. So we did this for approximately 2 years. On Wednesday nights and also on Sundays, we would play, record data, do field notes, etc. And after that period, we did a set of interviews. And the interviews, like I said, were constructed apart from the data we had from the initial codes from the servers, combined with our observations that we did from playing. Now, the interviews, I don't have the questions handy here. If you want them, I'm always happy to make them available. But if you look at the next page, the typology of Counter-Strike interview codes, these 43 different typologies, 43 different codes, gives you an idea that from the interviews and the way that people responded to the questions, and the way we did these questions was an open-ended questionnaire. So we tried to be really careful about not leading people on so they would answer the way we wanted them to, but rather would keep it open-ended so they would just kind of go on and talk. And people would talk for like a long time, hour or 2 hours, especially the passionate players, they would go a long time. And I do have to say that one of my best interviews I ever had was with a female gamer from Taiwan who was white and spoke Mandarin. And man, her interview was just incredible. And so a lot of her materials in the paper that I have here. So the interview material was good. We coded these categories, and then we began to collapse the categories together through discussion in our group about how do we group these together in clusters that best illustrate the type of worlds that are being created, the types of topics that we should be talking about. And that's the last handout that I have for you all, which is the compiled interview codes for Counter-Strike. And you can see, I think I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, just enough to kind of count for the 8 chapters of a book, which is useful. In terms of the material we got from all of these interviews that we had, which included, again, the sample of players I played with, the undergraduates that were also playing with us, plus we had a sample of people outside the university who had played in other campuses in other areas, like the woman from Taiwan, elsewhere. I wish I would have had more female representation, but as it is, we only had really 2 women that answered in our sample. Most of them were men. Again, it's a small sample. We're talking 23 interviews here, but they're in depth. And that's what I wanted, was not so much, we could have kept interviewing people left and right, but for us, the important thing was not the salient aspect of how many, the numbers, random, the random distribution was not as significant as what was actually occurring within their understanding of what they were doing. So we were more interested in that. We stopped doing the interviews when we got a repetition of responses that kept coming up over and over again, which gave us a sense that we had kind of reached the limits, you might say, of the world talk that was happening around that. So, briefly speaking, those were the methods that we used and what we came up with in terms of our codes. But of course, the problem is, so what, right? So what does this mean to have these elaborate social worlds with these kinds of categories of codes that are going on? And that's what I've been spending the past 5 years trying to scratch my head to figure out as well. Because again, at one level, this material seems obvious, right? It seems obvious. But I think as a sociologist, I would say at a deeper level, it's not obvious at all. This stuff is very dense and very interconnected at many different levels. Race, class, gender issues, performance issues, masculinity issues, a whole bunch of things come into play here, which I think are important to pay attention to. So the reason I called this talk the pleasures, and by the way, let me just say, if people want to stop me at any time, please do so. Really, I encourage you to, if you know, raise your hand or if you have a question, because I'm more comfortable rather than just giving a straight lecture with a give and take material around specific points, because that's how we both learn the process there. The reason I call this the pleasures of virtual fantasy warfare, learning from Counter-Strike, is a different version than the paper that I originally gave. And the original topic of this paper that I gave at the Midwestern meetings in Omaha, Nebraska, was called Killing Zombies, Terrorists, and Aliens, the Pleasures and Anxieties of Symbolic Violence. So that was the initial talk that I gave to a small group of sociologists. But I have to say there were more people here at this talk than I had at that talk, which I find really heartening. So this is good. So I'm looking forward to hearing feedback from all of you about your observations of what I came up with around this type of material. So let's go to the next one, the next picture. Do I just press the button here? Which one is it?
To your left.
Over here? Oh, this thing right here? Is that what that is? Oh, cool. Let's go like this, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Hey, listen, you know, I just learned PowerPoint. I've been using transparencies the whole time until I found out Microsoft doesn't have any transparencies for overheads. So this has been new for me, I must say, even though I do play computer games. Some of the questions I was asking among the people who play Counter-Strike, but also I was asking myself about the data is, what are the differences between single-player and multiplayer FPS games? Which is a fundamental difference if you're talking about game design. It's also a difference in terms of how you deal with the social construction of worlds that people create and how they talk about those worlds. The sample I work with almost entirely were players who, according to what they said, they were not interested in single-player games. Now I tend to be interested in single-player games because I don't like to get beat all the time. But even with bots. But they were most interested in playing with their friends in a multiplayer context, usually in a LAN context, as opposed to just on the internet, unless we're talking about younger undergraduates who really didn't care and like to show their mettle by playing strangers on the internet. The older graduate students that I played with, which were philosophy graduate students, interesting enough, all of them knew each other, really did not want to play with people on the internet, but wanted to play with their friends, with people who had equal skill level, because they knew if they didn't, they would all be whooped. The undergraduates were a little more open to that and had a much broader basis for thinking about success and failure. So again, the differences between these two, the single player and multiplayer, has to do, at least from what I can tell from the sample, has to do with the involvement of friendship bonding, the development of community, the development of spaces. What I talked about earlier, and I told Daniel this earlier, one of the key observations that has come out of this data for me anyway has been the importance of the physical venue of where people actually play. There's a lot of talk, whether you read PC Gamer or the game industry, that the issue of software criticism, or you critique one game or another game, or you look at how people play. But what I found really interesting were two things: how people got involved in playing, and in the process of getting involved, where they played, the actual physical location. So what I made an argument for in the earlier paper, the one I gave in Finland, was that On this campus in particular, many students, especially the undergraduates, not so much the graduates, but especially the undergraduates, felt that they had no adequate social space to create what Oldenburg would call third spaces. That is, a place to be social, to relax, to be energized, to hang out with each other, etc. And so for these students, you'd have biology majors, computer science majors, all kinds of people who would meet each other in the classrooms. And when they went to the computer center and played on the terminals, that became their social space. And like, I have really good quotes. One guy says, hey, what am I going to do after class? Go back, watch TV, go to sleep in my dorm room. So for him, this particular activity of game playing became a way to create a context within which the friendships that had been established through the classroom could be reproduced. Plus, there's a whole camaraderie that goes on with shooter games where you get to say, slap each other in the back. Oh, yeah, man, I got you the other time. Yeah, I got you with a grenade. Ha ha, you didn't move fast enough. So you get this kind of back and forth, give and take, really a kind of an understanding of friendship that goes on. What they've called male bonding, but what I've said in there is not confined by gender. And I think it's important not to assume, as some people do, that gender implies that this kind of behavior is purely male. That's not true. I mean, you can have female gamers, you all know this, you have female clans that are just as rough as male clans and have the same kind of friendship characteristics as well. So it's not in terms of that's what gets reproduced and gets policed a lot in the trash talking that goes on and elsewhere. But it's not specifically gendered around this other than what male players make of it to other players, right? And we could talk about that in a second if you want to talk. I have a bunch of material on that as well. So anyway, to get back to the point, how do players learn the game? From a variety of different sources. Some get it, they learn it from their brothers or sisters, well, mostly the brothers, or they'll learn it from their fathers. Usually it's bought by somebody else, their friends most often. And also what we can see here is that what players do is it's how they learn is also connected with their access to resources. So over and over again, I heard, especially from the undergraduates, that they would start out with consoles because they may have a console in the house connected to a TV, but they wouldn't have a PC because it was too expensive. So for example, I had people who played console games, but then when their friends began to play at the internet cafe, they would switch from the console to the PC at the internet cafes and begin to play there. And eventually, when they went to college, following their friends to college, they would then follow it with a PC that they used for their courses there. So the platform of game playing is really significant, as most of you probably know. And it's significant because it's connected to the social opportunities that different groups have that are going to school. In this case, the university students. But I would think that's across the board as well. The significance of playing venues, as I said, has a lot to do with, I think, culture and society. Insofar as I would argue, and this is one of the interesting things I had about my female gamer from Taiwan, is how is it that the society that you're in supports game playing as something other than a waste of time, right? And in a place like Korea, right, or Taiwan, or even now in China, which has some of the largest gaming populations in the world, you have active support not only by the government but by TV stations. You have internet cafes that have 200 or 300 computers at a stance. You have people getting espresso and soft drinks and free food. That is, what you have is a real social system that supports these cafes as legitimate community centers for the population at large. Not just teenagers, right, but the whole population at large. One of the interesting things that the female gamer said to me is that when she was there, and she was there teaching English in Taiwan, she said that people would use various words, like I think sula was one word, like a cuss word in Taiwanese, and there was one word I think that means garlic or something like that. There were all these kind of different types of derogatory terms that get used by players in different foreign contexts, right? So she knew all that because she also knew the language as well. And what was interesting is that she said most people that play here that are American, they don't play games. They check their internet. They check their email connections. And so for them to suddenly discover a white female who speaks not only English but also Mandarin, right, and it could communicate on the screen in that native language was a real shock to many of the players there. So there was a modification of their behavior simply because suddenly, whoa, this is unusual. So I think that what you have here is the these venues, in this case the internet cafes, become one vehicle of community. In America, I think we used to have a larger, in a sense, internet cafe system here than we do now. I mean, what I've seen is it shrink over the years in terms of places where people can actually play in public. I mean, you always have your little computer centers like Screen Z and places like this, but the number of computers they have are usually very small, dedicated to gaming. Most of it tends to be email or internet access, things of that nature. And so what I've seen is a privatization of game playing, a movement more into people's homes, consoles, etc., in a way, except for universities where you might have people playing on dorm rooms or other areas where that's a context. I think that's from a combination of different factors, which may be both a moral panic that centers around playing games, violent games especially, and the fear that many parents have about that. It may be from a number of things that you don't quite see in other countries. Right? It's a different acceptability there. So the venue I found was really important for many of these people. The undergraduates in my sample tended to play in the computer labs and not in the library. You have to understand that the people that played in the library were there because the graduate students worked there. So they had access after hours to these offices, which they were able to use. But the undergraduates felt more comfortable playing together as themselves, as their own team. Graduate students were more comfortable with themselves. So one of the things I also observed was the age difference. And that seems to be the primary demarcation from what I can tell about how people responded to playing the game. The different ages had a big impact on whether people were going to Rambo in their behavior, the kind of trash talking they did, the kind of interactions they did. It had a lot to do with, were you an undergraduate or a graduate student? Now, not totally, but that's what kept coming out over and over again in this. Maybe it's just the older guys just slower, I don't know. Who knows? But they were, I think the oldest player, if I don't count myself, was probably 35 in terms of graduate students, and the youngest one was 18 among undergraduates. The other question is the social networks created and existing friendships supported. I talked a little bit about that, but clearly what you had here was not only existing friendships from people thrown together in the same dorm rooms, but also new friendships that would be created through the activity of playing. That is, in a sense, to have any kind of friendship bonding, you have to have a common activity. And in a campus where we did this research, there was little of that going on. So the gameplay provided that cement, if you will, for a diverse number of people to come together, talk about what's going on, aside from the game itself. So people often use it for talking about other activities, like why they flunked the biology exam the previous day or whatever it might be. So it'd be a lot of interesting insights. Finally, how does performance competence generate trust between players and reinforce social norms? The other thing that was obvious was that people wanted to play with people at their own competency level. I think most of you agree that you don't want to play with somebody who's a lot better than you. I mean, maybe a little bit better, but not a lot better. Because after a while, it gets pretty boring to be beaten over and over and over again. So the idea of equal competency, or at least approximately equal skill level, gives the ability for people to win and lose in a roughly equal fashion, which is kind of the ideal inside the sweet spot for gameplay around this. If you have all newbies, well, if you're expert, unless you really like slaughtering newbies, it's not going to be all that much fun. It'll be boring pretty quick. So what we found is that the actual more experienced players were the undergraduate players. They had played a lot longer than the graduate students, maybe because they didn't have to do dissertations for whatever reason. But they wanted to play with themselves, and they were less afraid to play with people on the internet because they felt they were more competent at the things that they were doing. The interesting things about this issue of what I would call performance competency, or performance competence, is that I would argue that the degree of skill creates a foundation for trust within the community, not the other way around. It's not that you trust somebody and then you become performance competent. It's, in fact, your ability to perform within a game, in this context, at a certain level, allows other people to trust your reactions to their behavior. Just as the same thing with trash talking. If you trash talk with strangers, you don't know what the intention of that trash talk is about. You don't know if they mean it as a joke. You don't know if they mean it seriously. You don't know if they mean it, in a way that's insulting or a way that's a parody. You just don't know. If it's a friend who trash talks, there's usually an understanding, even if it's tacit understanding or unconscious, that says, hey, we can joke about this, but we can't joke about that. We can go this far, but we can't go that far. So there's a shared structure about that trust, which comes about and is expressed in the kinds of talk that people do around insults and trash talking. Okay. So there's more we can say about this at a later stage. But I just wanted to get this out here, first of all. Okay, let's go to the next one. Should I stop for questions really quick, by the way? People have any questions they want to ask? Please feel free. Comments, criticisms, please, criticisms. Welcome criticisms. No? Okay, we'll do the next one then. I'm sure there'll be more. What the data shows, at least what I've seen, is these are the kinds of ranges of pleasures and anxieties that kept coming up over and over and over again, not only in the talk but also the playing itself in our our fieldwork observations as well as the interviews. What I call performative skill, frustration, and nervousness is all part of playing a game like Counter-Strike. As all of you understand this, I mean, how many of you have not had sweaty palms at some point playing Counter-Strike, right? Right? I mean, at some point you kind of like, especially when you're the last one holding the team together and you're the last one with like health point down to about 5%, and it's like all the pressure's on you and everybody's going, right? And so you're kind of going, I won't die. So in terms of, I mean, with single player it's a whole different ballgame, right? But with multiplayers where you have other friends around you, the possibility of getting, berated moves from a 1 to a 10. So in that context, it tends to increase your skill because you become more either nervous or you become good at repressing your nervousness really well. And I have a lot of material on this. I have lots of quotes on this, which I can give you, but I would rather not get sidetracked into quotes unless really people want to hear that. Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, I have a question. It probably has actually more to do with the previous slide, but
sure.
So you looked at Counter-Strike play in a specific place at this university campus,
right?
And,
well, at least for these players, there was other people that played in other venues as well.
Okay, and you interviewed 23 people,
right?
And you said, okay, this is enough. We're getting repetition here.
That's at least in terms of what we had there. Yeah, in terms of the patterns that they had.
My question is, since it was some time ago you
made
the interviews, my question is, well, actually, it doesn't have to do with time, but that's another. But you've talked to lots of people. I presume that you've talked with people about this material. And do you think that there are differences? I'm from Europe, so do you think that there are significant? Have you went?
Yeah, I've thought about that. I mean, I've talked with Helen Kennedy, about this, and Jason Rudder and people. And my sense is that the basics remain the same in terms of the performance skill and the kind of emotions that are going on here. I think there's probably specific differences depending upon how people play the game. Again, I think that's why it's important to ask the question, do people play LAN games? Do they play online with friends or strangers? For me, what was interesting was, why would people want to play with strangers if they can play with friends? Why would you want to play with people who you can't trust? And a lot of these guys, they say, well, we'll play with strangers because we make new friends. Because we play long enough on the same server, people get to know who you are, they begin to trust your reactions and, well, supposedly trust your reactions. So that in a way, it's also not just about cementing existing friendships, but building new friendships, and it's really quite hard work. Because in a sense, you have to prove your competency, not only with the game, but you have to prove your competency with a friendship. Which means, how do you reciprocate if somebody's doing this and you're doing that, even within the structure of the game? So I think that remains consistent throughout all, whether it's Europe, here, or anywhere else. I think the specifics may change because of the culture, and also because of the time factors as well. But again, I don't have enough data to really say that definitively, but that would be my guess about that. Yeah, Dennis.
Is the kind of trust you're talking about more the ability to predict another person's responses, or is it more the kind of trust like, I know this person will watch my back regardless of the situation? Because there's two different.
Absolutely.
I can trust that you'll be point guard and you'll do what a point guard does, or I'll trust you'll take care of me.
I think it's both. And that came out actually in the interviews, and because I asked them a question, I had this category that said sacrificing. Are you willing to sacrifice yourself for your buddy? A lot of people didn't know, what does that mean? They're like, what? They're scratching their head going like, did I ask a stupid question? But when it actually came to performance, what I noticed a lot is people in fact were doing that. That they may not articulate it in that direct way, but in fact when people would be firing, people would be checking behind them to look to see if someone was coming up. Of course, they didn't do it a lot of times when I was playing, so I would be kind of sneak around the back. I didn't do things necessarily according to the rules. I made my own rules up as I went along, which got a lot of irritated players in my team. But we won, hey, so all fair in love and war. But I think the trust factor works on both levels. I think it works both in terms of your constructing your expectations about what your behavior is going to be, to try to predict that. And I think it also works because it means that if you frag somebody, or if you embarrass them, let's say, embarrassing is kind of a strong word because, let's face it, it's a game. But there are times when you have knife kills, for example, when you're going, oh my God, is that stupid or what? And then everybody laughs like crazy, which is why one of the things I'm going to talk about is the importance of laughter, right? So the issue of what you laugh at becomes a key element of that cementing that trust, right? I mean, if there are people that don't laugh and they don't think it's funny, then you have a serious issue with how do you keep playing the game with somebody who you think may be a big A, and so that's a problem. So part of the issue of having shared friendship networks is that you can trust people that they won't go overboard and becoming extreme and getting so angry that they'll stomp off, or that next day you have to deal with them, in some other area, that somehow, it's all in the game, it's fine, great, whatever it might be. So I think that's important. I think the shared trust element is important both for watching your back, but I think it's also important for, you're right, for estimating how someone else is going to act in the game itself. Part of the reason with the men I work with is there will be, and this goes back to the physical venue question as well. The reason why a lot of them like to play, for example, in this library context where there were 5 computers in kind of set up like this in cubicles, they were pretty much like about maybe from here to about over here. So you could talk to someone, just turn and talk to someone pretty easily. There was always, I think, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, competition for those computers. Everybody wanted to be in the room with 5 computers. So if you were late, hey, tough. You get to go sit out in the office space out there with the other cubicles, isolated from everybody. You can still play, you're still virtually in the game, but you're not physically present. So of course what happens is, as you might imagine, the people in the 5 computers begin to talk to one another even if they're dead, which some people would define as cheating, but which we define as, well, you're there just talking, and you encourage people to talk out in the big room, but because of the physical space, it's much more different to kind of communicate to somebody they should turn left and not right, unless you yell at them to do that. So what became important, I found, is that the actual physical structure of the space had a lot to do with encouraging the bonding that was going on in the playing. And that was something I didn't expect when I started this. I figured, oh, well, it's virtual space, fine. People can, they can play, they can kind of see each other in the game. But in fact, what became interesting to me was how people checked their behavior with other players by talking in the physical space itself. And I thought that was interesting, how that worked. So that's part of the reason why I said in the paper I gave in Finland that I thought that the physical venue is an important area that needs more research about how the actual physical space of play affects not only the playing of the game, but the kinds of bonding that goes on between people in the game itself and outside the game. I think that's an essential ingredient about that. Does that answer your question too, Daniel? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, please.
Do you have any rough estimation of the relative number of people who play physically co-located versus separate? Because my impression is that almost never happens.
Right.
Because most people aren't in college anymore.
Right.
Whereas when I was in college, I would have thought that was always the case because that was always the case for me.
Yeah,
so
no,
I'm just wondering what the relative percentages are.
I really wish I had data on that. I mean, that would be the kind of research we should try to get data on. I don't have it per se. My speculation would be, however, is that people with network computers, I guess the ease with which you can network computers becomes a key element here, right? Let me say this. If, for example, I know this so well, it used to be where you would take your PC apart, take it to a friend's house, hook it up, and I mean, oh my God, you can imagine how much work. Imagine if you have laptops that are gaming computers where you just take one cable, put them in, go to a friend's house, connect it, and you're instantly there. That kind of LAN network, I think, still goes on in various guilds, competitions, people that play together. But I also think that the internet cafes, at least in Korea and Taiwan, are the spaces where a lot of this happens. And there's spaces where you have a real intense sense of community there, a really diverse community of people from all ages and stripes doing gaming work. I think here, I'm not so sure. I think in the US, because of its widespread dispersion, people are more likely to be on their computers by themselves, but not necessarily. My speculation would be, though, yeah, I think they would be. I think you're right. In college, you see this more often in a collective context. And that could also be because of the age, because of the socialization that college produces. And when you get out of college, also you have quite often other responsibilities, family, right? Other job responsibilities that's going to take you away. I think in that context, what I would be interested in looking at is how is it really reflected in the job place, in the workplace. I mean, we all know what happened when Doom was introduced, right? And everybody kind of go, oh God, it's like Doom's on all the servers now. It's like slowing down our work productivity. It's like, oh God. So that actually the workplace became a center for creating community around the gameplay. And I would argue that that's probably still the case, although it may be more covert now because of management's concerns about this. But these are all speculations I'm making. I don't have any hard data, I wish I did, on where people actually played. Okay, the other key points are outsmarting one's opponent, which of course is one of the main pleasures that we all have. And that could be outsmarting even a bot, right? If you're playing a single player game, I have to say, it's so much, I told this to Daniel, I said, the pleasure is not so much having monsters shoot at you, it's having monsters shoot at each other when you've created the situation. So when you outsmart a group of bad guys and they start having a firefight with each other, and you just kind of step back and kind of laugh yourself silly going, man, are they stupid or what? That's another form of pleasure that you wouldn't ordinarily have if they were just firing at you directly, right? So that has a lot to do with the production of AI and how you do the artificial intelligence. But outsmarting is something that I think is a fundamental pleasure for any game. How do you outsmart the computer? How do you outsmart other players? It's this fundamental basic of all sports, right? Whether you're playing chess, football, or anything else. Friendship bonding, trust and emotions. And then the last 2 points, and I'm going to go back over some of these in a minute, are what I would like to focus on more is the issue of laughter, which I think is the dominant emotion that occurs in playing Counter-Strike, and I think in most games. And I've often figured out, why are people laughing themselves silly where they're practically falling off their chairs? I mean, people are just like laughing themselves crazy with this and going, I mean, to an outsider, they think we're all nuts. But we're going, where is this laughter coming from? How is this possible? Shooting some simple things on a screen, that's possible. And so what I looked at was the kinds of laughter that people had, the kinds of situations that evoked that laughter. And what I came up with is that the only way I could explain this was by talking about slapstick humor and the grotesque, or the importance of the carnival. And the context of, in fact, the paper I gave at the Midwest meetings around this issue is a context that says that the world we live in is a rationalized world, right, with rules and bureaucracies, right, and elaborate systems of interchange, how we talk, how we don't talk. The thing about the carnival and the issue of the grotesque, and we can trace the grotesque if we want back to the 14th and 15th century, was always represented by figures like the Joker, the trickster. And every culture has this kind of aspect of that which violates the norm, the social norms, the boundaries of quote, proper behavior. But the issue of laughter and slapstick humor has always been revolved around, in a sense, those who have been oppressed or those who have been marginalized rising up against those who oppress them in some form or fashion. Joke telling is a big way people do it. In a sense, if you think about rap music, it also emerged from the same type of premise, usually in the prison system. If you think about all kinds of humor, to a degree, has both a transgressive quality to it, but it also has the flip side of that, which is it reinforces existing social norms as well. So it has two qualities. Humor can both reinforce existing social norms, especially if it's directed at minority groups, women, gays and lesbians, etc. It can also work to subvert those norms. Right? So when people say, And I think that part of the concern about video games or violent movies or whatever has a lot to do with people only reading that side of laughter that's about reproducing these hierarchies of power. But what's, I think, often ignored, especially with the grotesque and the carnival, is how this material also can subvert that power. It can go both ways, in other words, is what I'm saying. And it's not clear which way it's going to go, which is why it makes it unstable when we think about this. Finally, the last point I was going to make was about violent representations in the grotesque, which is where it really comes out, bloodletting and everything else, brains popping and all that. Yes?
There are also some reports of humor and laughter as a stress relief, particularly like people in mobile armies, or surgical hospitals, etc.
Absolutely.
Who've just dealt with so much stress and disaster that the relief of stress is just this total sort of abandon.
Oh, absolutely.
It's over. So I'm wondering if you can differentiate those hypotheses of a kind of, I agree, a kind of slapstick humor, grotesque, etc., versus we've just been under so much stress now, it's just a relief.
Well, I think what would help that in terms of answering it would be to look at the kinds of laughter situations that occurred, which I was going to talk about in just a second. And I think the other part of this is when we're talking about the grotesque, oftentimes we're talking about, in real life, the grotesque would be something very serious. It'd be that which is ugly, or what Immanuel Kant would call the sublime, right? So this idea of the grotesque, and people like Julia Kristeva have written about this in the idea of horror films, right? What she calls abject horror. You have to ask the question, why do people love horror films? At least, especially, why do young girls like horror films? It's true. The biggest audience for horror movies are, in fact, young teenage girls. Why is that? And the reason it exists is because what you have in the narrative structure of these movies is the good girl always gets like the Freddy Krueger right away. And the bad girl, so to speak, the one who is kind of the outsider, is the one who ultimately defeats the monster. So it's a form of massive empowerment for young girls to watch these things who like this, so that the grotesque is actually a representation of their own power. And I think that that's what's often not discussed in the culture and neglected, and it's part not neglected because we also tend not to take seriously women's power, right? So in a sense, we trap women back in the same box and young girls in the same box by thinking they should be prim and proper and that they should be this way and nurturing, when in fact, like all human beings, they have motivations like men as well. And so how we play with those, and I think the issue again is play. Right? We're not talking about people being mass murderers here, right? We're talking about people playing at violence, playing at the grotesque in a way that gives them a symbolic feeling of empowerment so they can move beyond the reactive forms that they have about the violence that may exist in their own lives. Right? I think that's what I've seen happen a lot. For sure, and remind me again, I want to get back to that question. For sure, one of the things that came up as a theme in talking with these players and playing with them, we asked this a lot, is the question of realism, going back to the issue of the grotesque. And they were very divided. Some of the players didn't like to see the blood spurting, the fake as it was. That, someone said, well, if it gets too realistic, I don't want to see the body organs fall out, Other people said they didn't care, they liked it, the ones who liked the slasher films. So it was a very mixed bag in terms of how people responded to what I would call violent representations as opposed to real violence. And I think this is the key point to keep in mind. We're talking about that there's a distinction between violent representation and real violence that often gets left out of the public discussion. I'll never forget this quote, and I should find this quote for you all because I think this is a really important one, that one of the players said here, and let me just find this quickly here. He said, I have it right here. Well, some invoke the notion of Counter-Strike. Quake, because they like gibbing that comes from using the rockets. But when it came to actually talking about the connection with this in real life violence, there was a whole different discussion about this. Here's what he said. This is Marcus. What Marcus says, we asked him what he thought about the distinction between realism, realistic violence versus the fake violence you see in Counter-Strike. He said, like the stuff in the news, people die, people suffer, people are maimed, and there was a pizza shop in Israel that was blown just recently. When I was there, I went there, I mean, they showed the pictures, and I've been there, I've eaten there. My friends were there, and a letter was sent to me by my rabbi there and said, so this is you, you know, the daughter. So he sent me a letter and said, you know, this is what happened, and that sort of thing. I don't know how much different you can get between real life, towers falling down, or bombs going off, and a bunch of people sitting around basically in the dark hitting keys on a keyboard, you know, hooting and hollering and having fun. They're more than worlds apart, I say. So I found this reaction a lot, that is the distinction between real life violence and fictional violence was very, very strong in all the players I talk with. There's no way, and like I make a point in the paper, the interesting thing about this study is I was doing it before and after 9/11. So I got to witness the change among the players as this whole event happened and unfolded. They stopped playing for 3 weeks and said nobody wanted to play terrorists at that stage of the game. And then you had Osama bin forgotten, kind of all the online names that began to emerge from this. So to say it's completely out of the pale, that it's not connected to reality is false. I mean, game playing is also part of reality. It's going to invariably bring in real concern, real life issues into the action of the game itself, if only, but you know, between the talk of the players themselves. So I think it's important to understand that the issue of realism and a violent representation of the grotesque is an issue that's in process. It's not decided that, well, we should show no blood, or yes, we should show blood, or whatever. I think the best way to think about this is if the player's given a choice of how grotesque they want the images to be, then that's their choice, right? Rather than saying, oh, like people remember the old Soldier of Fortune games, right? Where if you know, it had the damage so that, you know, you get the point, where things are really grotesque. Because part of what they say is that the graphic aspect of this is, for many of them, secondary to the actual gameplay. That what becomes important is how well you can maneuver, how well you can outsmart opponents, etc. So that actually becomes a defining quality. Some said that they were distracted by the realism. Other people liked it. So again, I would say it's an open-ended question that I don't have a sufficient answer for, and I can't tell you that. I think it depends on different audiences. Some audiences love the blood and guts flying everywhere. Other audiences don't. And I think in terms of being a game developer, I think it would depend upon how you're going to structure that for the audience that you're trying to after. I mean, I think that, you know, people that made Manhunt, for example, got in serious trouble, partly because the age group they were trying to reach in terms of that representation, which, and in all fairness, even that age group might not have a problem with that, but their parents will. So the issue becomes one of, it's a deeper issue about graphic violence, which goes back to the media effects perspective, which is to what degree does this have a harmful impact on people? And what I've seen in the literature and what I've critiqued is that, in fact, it depends. Some people can watch Mary Poppins and have nightmares, right? Other people can watch, you know, Freddy Krueger / you know, body number 39 and laugh themselves silly and sleep perfectly well. So I think it really becomes one of almost an individual ability, right, to deal with conflict and violence around these issues that you can't predict ahead of time. You know, I think that's what comes out in the merge. Let me tell you about the laughter part, because I want to go back to, is it Dennis? Yeah. I want to go back to Dennis's question about the kinds of laughter, because I think I've got to tell you this is very good, what they discuss here. At least what I found in Counter-Strike is that most of the times people were laughing had to do with situations that had to do with player behavior. There were often contradictions by what they expected. I remember really clearly playing I don't know if people play, remember people know the map High Rise? You guys know the High Rise? Remember the map High Rise, the unfinished building that people run around in Counter-Strike? Do people remember that? One of the things that people used to do all the time in ours is they used to jump off the building, because they thought it was so funny to hear the screams falling down and the splat at the end. And so they would deliberately go up there and like, oh, and flaps, and they're like, okay, fine, wait till the next map. So that became this kind of slapstick humor that was playing with the sounds of death and violence, the kind of falling off, thinking like, oh, hey, you know, it's like the Three Stooges or the Keystone Cops type of thing. That's in terms of actually using the game. There was other things too, like failing to anticipate an opponent's move that leads to an embarrassing death. like I have a quote here. He says, this is from Mick. He says, usually when somebody is just completely unaware, caught off guard, usually I'm not laughing if I'm the one that's doing something funny, you know. But if I see somebody who clearly walks backward into his demise, usually the biggest laugh, though, is when one of the other guys types or writes or says something really funny, and it's usually a Simpson quote. They love The Simpsons, the group I work with, is what it is. And it's appropriate to the situation. Like one that was, quote, a lot of times was Ralph, the character in The Simpsons, who's kind of an idiot kid or a mentally slow kid. He would look into the sun, and one of his famous lines is, "My cat's breath smells like cat food." So somebody on the net was playing our game and said something really dumb. And so Daryl just types back, "My cat just," mocking him. We started cracking up, you know, because no one got it, of course, but us, and that's the beauty of it. So there's a lot of this in-joke that goes on, right? The in-joke telling among the group of players that helps to also cement that trust factor, right? The friendship bonding. So again, it's that playing with cartoon violence, the ability to play with that becomes the important aspect of this. I mentioned the issue of high rise where people would play. This is what Daryl says about that. He says, talking about people falling off the edge of the skyscraper, he says, he sounds like Goofy from those old Disney cartoons where he's like, makes a sound, you know, and he falls off a building. And that's always funny because, you know, somebody messed up and somebody somewhere is pounding their forehead going, God, I can't believe I screwed up so badly to just run off the edge of the building. Yeah, that's always funny. It's always funny to fall off the building. Because, I mean, you have to understand, right? We're talking people like prowling around, you know, with their MP5s or whatever, ready to be serious counter-terrorists or terrorists, and suddenly like, oh my God, they're, you know, slipping off the edge of the building like when you didn't anticipate because you didn't see it. So the unanticipated effect of your behavior leads to incredible humorous situations. There's also the surprise kill, which I think hopefully most of us know about that, and hopefully haven't been on the receiving end of that one. He said, this is from Bryson. Bryson says, well, usually those sort of surprise kills, that's when you laugh the most often. Or when somebody is trying to defuse a bomb and they blow up and you see their body flying across. Those are all funny moments. But I suppose I would explain it in terms of slapstick comedy. I mean, obviously, you see people get hurt and fall down in a comic situation all the time and you laugh, like Kramer in Seinfeld or Homer in The Simpsons. And you don't think, oh my gosh, is he okay? It's horrible, right? But it's just sort of the surprise of seeing a pratfall. It just so happens it's a pratfall of somebody getting killed, but I think the parallels are the same there. And he goes on to talk about unusual sounds within the situation, within the games as well. One of the things that also happens is when people get stuck, part of the humor that I've also found has a lot to do with the game mechanics. And many of you know this too, when the maps get stuck on certain parts. One player got stuck at the bottom of this ravine and didn't see the fact that he was firing from behind a set of explosive barrels. So, of course, the opponent, who could see the barrels and he didn't, blew up the barrels and he went flying what would be equivalent of 200 feet up in the air, and everybody just laughed themselves silly and fell off their chairs about this one, how he could be so dumb not to see this. So a lot of it's about anticipating your opponent, but it's also about being aware of your environment. So when you're not aware of your environment, even your virtual environment, is when the humor begins. Like when you're creeping around very seriously and somebody kind of comes up and, you know, taps you, and that's it. It's like, oh no, it's like, you know, you thought you were so cool, right? That disappeared in a hurry. Okay. In terms of action, I have a good quote here about rescuing hostages. And if you played Counter-Strike, you all know about rescuing hostages, or the lack thereof, especially when the hostages don't want to be rescued, which is always a big problem with game glitches on maps that don't quite work right. What Bruce says, he says, the one thing I think is funny, I think this is a good example of this, is it's always funny, not always, but almost always funny, whenever a counter-terrorist is supposed to be rescuing hostages. And the hostages, it seems like about a third of the time they get hung up and they can't follow the person. Either because they get hung up behind a box, or who knows, sometimes they float in the air 5 feet up and you have no idea why they can't follow you. It's always funny whenever counter-terrorists shoot the people the hostages are supposed to rescue, just out of frustration. It's not, they're not playing their part. So the answer to that is really, you know, screw you, I'll shoot you. That's what's funny. No. So again, you know, player behavior is an endless source of humor aside from these map aspects. I mean, we all know about being a newbie, right? And oh God, newbies is like, oh, it's so like sad when you're a newbie. And you have to have a really thick skin to be able to pursue this. But like Lewis comments, he says, some stupid things people do just cracks me up. What happens, for example, the whole team's sitting there and somebody comes from behind and just slaughters all of them. Like I did with a grenade. I threw a grenade once, took 3 people out in one blow and won the game for that session. They were all going, wait a minute, you were supposed to be over there in the team, not Ramboing around the side. I said, well, it's like, I saw an opportunity and I took it, and they're all like embarrassed going, oh God, we didn't see Dr. Wright coming around the corner. It's like, oh no. But Lewis goes on, he says, I think that's pretty amusing. I mean, have you heard the expression called, they were gimped? A gimp is somebody, I don't know how to explain it. Gimp, yeah, gimp. My friends would laugh at trying to explain this if they knew I was explaining this to you. It's somebody awkward that does stupid things, who embarrasses himself, a klutz. He doesn't know anything like a newbie, but yeah, a gimp is another word for a loser, I guess. So when you say he got gimped, she got gimped, or they were gimped, they were completely slaughtered or embarrassed, or they don't know what they're doing or stuff like that. Basically, idiotic kind of thing. And what that often means, at least for if you're a newbie, is partly not knowing the rules, but this goes back to the issue of performance skills. If you have high levels of performance skills playing against somebody who doesn't, the person you're playing against who doesn't have the skills is going to have a high level of gimping going on. Just because you have the ability to anticipate and move your character and do whatever. So for example, what Tony says, he says, talking about this behavior, he says, when grenades explode in your hand, or you toss it against the wall and it comes back to you and you die, many of us have that experience. When I see people kill themselves with grenades or even shooting, I think that's the unrealistic part about video games, is when the bullets hit the wall but they kill you because they bounce back sometimes. I guess that could happen in real life, but the chances of that are just so slim, and killing you no less. That's funny, I think. And then sometimes when one guy beats 7 guys and you think the 7 guys should win, but they all suck equally bad. So it's like lambs running to the slaughterhouse and just boom, boom, boom. And then you're just like, wow, stupid. When you get a double kill and 2 guys die, that's funny. I mean, there's too many to recount, I guess, but those are some of the major ones, the multiple kills that you have. So again, to an outsider who's not a gamer, this sounds horrendous what I'm talking about, doesn't it? I mean, it sounds like, oh my God, I'm being so immoral here. Reproducing death and destruction and dying. But it does raise the issue with that kind of grotesque quality of the aspect of realism that we discussed earlier, and that's why that came up in our conversation, was the basis for the laughter that people had often were centered around the issues of the grotesque representations of violence. So then the question you ask is, well, okay, how far do you go with this? What becomes realistic? What kind of images do you show? What kind of avatars do you show? Do you show women, men? Do you show races? Where do you separate the line about how this goes? And I know a lot of the people I played with would be very uncomfortable with some of the games that are out there, especially the stuff that some of the neo-Nazis have produced, right? Some of the right-wing groups have produced. There's a lot of really bad games out there that have, in a sense, ideological agendas that are really, in a sense, racist, sexist, etc., that are explicit about this. And I think that that's where the concern I have lies, which is how, in a sense, these games can both, again, the humor can transgress some of these aspects, right, of racism, sexism, but I would argue they can also reinforce it. And the question is, that I would always say, is that they do both at the same time, which is what makes them, in a sense, objects of power. Or what Victor Turner would say, objects of symbolic condensation. They basically act as condensers for the culture of the kind of fears and anxieties that we have about various things, whether it's terrorism or anything else. Okay, let me finish off just by doing the last part, which is where I think, I mean, again, there's a lot more I could do here, but I think I want to wrap this up at least so we can have questions and answers. Where I think we can go with this in terms of further research. Although I like the question you raised about actually where people play. I think that's an important aspect, and I wish I could do that myself. These are some emerging areas that I would argue that could do more, that could actually take more consideration by not only game researchers but by sociologists in general, which is, one is what's going on with the modern nature of play, the modern nature of play. Part of what I'm going to be teaching in the fall, and I have a class I'm teaching on the sociology of play / digital games, is looking at the merging tendency between work and play blending into each other. And if you think about this, this is not so different than it was, in fact, in the 14th and 15th century, before the age of industrialization, when you had a strict split between work and play distinctions, which also, interestingly enough, coincided with the split between the private and the public, between work and home, and between women and men. That is, the gender distinctions where women were made powerless compared to men emerged out of the Victorian era of industrialization, where men went off to work, women stayed at home, etc. Prior to that period, women and men worked equally on the farms, equally in those kind of contexts. So you had a much more egalitarian, not perfect, but egalitarian system. If you want, everybody was mutually oppressed by the aristocracy at that point. That would be a way to talk about it. But in this day and age, what I would argue here is that play is often thought of purely as an escape from work. And what I keep trying to get people to understand is that play, yes, it can be an escape, but it's also a movement towards connection and expression. And that's what the work I keeps coming up with over and over again, that playing is not taken seriously enough in the culture. And when it is, play is treated as work. Right? It's instrumentalized. We think of as play like having instrumental goals, and you do this and you do that, rather than saying play as a vehicle for increasing community, for increasing art and connection and expression, all of which I think are significant in this day and age. So that's one area of work that needs, I think, a lot more investigation. And I would argue my field, sociology, it's still very much behind. I think anthropology is doing a much better job, and moving in the direction of investigating play and how it operates. I think sociology has a long way to come to catch up with that, and in part because of the assumptions that are structured by the split between work and play historically. Right? I think those are the assumptions that have to break down, and we need to open up that discussion around that. The second is, again, the issue of game playing, social relationships, and both physical and social space that I alluded to before. Is that how does the playing in certain venues actually promote social roles? How does playing by yourself, in fact, promote roles? Because let's face it, many of the people I play with, some of them also like playing by themselves. They didn't necessarily want to play with their friends. They wanted to play. Sometimes they just want to get away from people, get away from their friends, just play on their computers, and that's it. And why should we think of that as a negative thing as well? That in fact, you have to have both. You play by yourself, and you play with yourself. You play by yourself and you play with other people, right? And finally, I think the question that many of you are asking and I ask is, who is excluded from the play? This is a serious question, because this is about, historically women have been locked out of a lot of the game worlds and game development worlds. And in part, what I've noticed a lot, and I haven't talked about it here, but when I looked at trash talking, which is another section of the paper, what I was struck with, looking at the literature on masculinity and gender, is how it's not just that women don't want to play games like shooter games. They're actively policed and excluded by other boys and men from playing those games. That is, they're propositioned, right? They're talked down to. They're never treated with respect. They're trash talked, and we can say, oh, well, this is trash talking. But yeah, when you say that, people, again, that you don't know, that aren't your friends, what that implies is somehow you're inferior. So I think one of the aspects we have to ask as men in the context is, how does our behavior as adults and our children affect the ability for women to get on board with the technology that is involved? And I'll tell you, this is an important issue for a very simple reason, because boys, we've known from the studies that play games are further ahead than girls that don't play games in dealing with technology. And what happens quite often is girls get discouraged from using computers, from using technology. I mean, I see this even at my own university, where the computer tech department lacks women faculty. They need it desperately, but they're having a hard time finding people to hire who are women, who are taking engineering students, who are doing computer sciences. And it's in part because, I would argue, that discouragement happens at the ages 11, 12 years old, just before adolescence. And I think it happens in part not just because girls want to be like with other girls, it's because girls are told it's not okay to be with boys. And they're told that by other boys and by other girls. I think Dan remembers that lecture. Remember that one that, I think it was Ellen's talk, that she said, even other girls will discourage girls from involving, because then they're not the centerpiece for that. So I think the gender issue of power in technology is absolutely essential to overcome if we're going to advance beyond this kind of, old men's club, if you will, that has often shaped, the industry, and shape the players as well. So I want to stop there for a second and just open the debate, because I know I opened a lot of can of worms, I hope, for questions and answers, because I think this is where I want to learn from you all, from your experiences about this, of how this reflects with what you see as well. So thank you all. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to say was that the grotesque representations is quite related to the kind of skill that a player has when he's playing. Because, I used to play a lot of Quake 3 when I was in college. Depending upon when I started off, I used, it was just a normal start up Quake 3 as it is. Whatever the defaults, the way the game looks,
right.
I would play it just like that. But later on, as I got better in the game, I came to know that, okay, you can get rid of all this blood, and it will be easier for you to see your opponent. And it actually helps, in terms of visibility, in terms of how you play.
That's right. That's right.
Certain things like that are actually beneficial. And the more you know and the more you get into
Absolutely.
the game, you would potentially get it, be much, much better and much more effective.
Absolutely. In fact, it's interesting that you say that, because I asked this very question. I asked, like, when you're choosing Counter-Strike, which avatar do you like to play? And I asked people, I'm going like, but I didn't expect this answer. And this guy said, oh, I chose the one based upon the ability to disappear in the landscape. I'm going, whoa. So like, I thought he did because he wanted somebody that's cool, right? But for him, being cool meant playing a figure that he knew that other people would have a harder time spotting quicker than his own figure. And I'm thinking, okay, which one is it so I can choose it too, And so yeah, I mean, when you get that level of skill, when you know it's like knowing a map. When you know a game map so well, you basically can maneuver in ways that people who don't know it don't even think about doing that. And I mean, it's like taking advantage of glitches in the map that you might find, like knowing.
Even glitches in the physics engine.
Yeah, absolutely. I've watched a lot of that happen. Again, a lot of it's the basis of the humor that goes on. So I think that in a way we shortchange people in how they respond to these games, because we assume that they only have this one-dimensional way of looking at this kind of representation that occurs. And what I've been trying to say is how complicated this representation is, and how complicated the meanings are in this, and how interesting it is, and fascinating this stuff is. I mean, thank God I don't do World of Warcraft. I'd never get any work done. I mean, Counter-Strike, at least I can play for 15 minutes and give up, but my God, if I do World of Warcraft, I'm going to be sunk in my career. I'll be doing that all the time, So I agree. It's part of the issue of expertise becomes an important issue of the pleasure that goes on with this.
Is there a reason that you, in particular, that chose Counter-Strike as the game to focus on, and is there something that you believe about the nature of a game that makes it facilitate this kind of community building more or less?
Mm-hmm. Well, to be honest, I like playing Counter-Strike, but actually the reason I picked it was because at the time we did this research, which was actually it was probably 2000, 2001, 2002, that was the main game everybody was playing online, and that's the number of servers. At 8,000 servers, I think, were playing at the time. So two reasons I wanted to play a game that was a shooter game that everybody seemed to be playing worldwide. The second is I explicitly wanted a game that had blood. I mean, unlike a lot of my colleagues who may do EverQuest or may do more kind of tame games, I really wanted to tackle head-on the issue of violence, virtual violence, smack in the center. I didn't want to fade from that, because for me, I teach a class on mass media and pop culture, and I deal a lot with the kind of debates around media effects and violence. I deal a lot with the issues of, from both left and right points of view, of critiques. And I've been trying to get to a point in my own work where I look at these visual representations, these images, right, of violence, not as necessarily inherently good or bad, but as tools to access material that all of us have available to us. And the question of, in that sense, they're almost like ritualistic objects. Just like I would argue when a teenage girl watches a Freddy Krueger film and gets excited about winning, seeing Freddy oft for the umpteenth time, that there's something there that's beyond the violent representation. There's power in that image. This is the same thing that Stuart Hall said, the cultural studies person from the Birmingham School. He said, the thing about these, quote, taboo images is not to censor this material, because it's precisely those taboo images that have the most power in the culture. What you have to do is go into those images, develop them, exploit them, bring them out, bring the power out from that, and understand it consciously, so that they don't remain hidden and form into monsters, right? So that would be my response, and that's why I picked Counter-Strike. Is this? I could have just as easily picked, The Sims or something like that, but like, maybe I should have picked The Sims. I don't know. My life might have been better, But to me, I thought the issue of virtual violence, because it was on people's minds, right? Because people were talking about media effects, and because people like Hillary Clinton and the independent, everybody loves to hate as a Democrat, Lieberman, right? Like to complain about this. I looked at these critiques and going, there's something else going on here. What's happening about this? And let me just say one last thing about this, because I think this is important, and Daniel and I talked about this earlier. Part of my motivation for this is also a deeper one, which is simply that my past work with homeless people really taught me a lot about how people that are marginalized in society are really shut out by the dominant forces, and how that's an active process and not a passive one. And what I saw was the same shutting out of teenagers, of adolescents. They're not listening to kids, but going, yang, 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 you should do this, you should be this way, yang, 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 and not really like going like this, right? Not listening to where people are really at. So for me, the struggle for justice moves beyond just the field, right, of dealing with street people and homelessness and inequality, which is important. It has to go into the realm of mass media, mass culture. It has to be about saying, why do we keep blaming kids? Why don't we ask the question where the real violence for children comes from, right? Rather than trying to worry about them playing Counter-Strike, maybe we should worry about the fact that they're not getting enough to eat, they don't have enough medical care, they're getting beaten by their fathers and mothers, and where are those factors coming from? So for me, the violence that children experience is the real issue. It's not the gameplay. That's merely the superficial aspect that politicians love to tackle because they don't want to deal with the fundamental maldistribution of power and wealth in the society. Pure and simple. That's why I got involved in this, right? So I'm a gamer. I love playing games and all that, but the deeper level of for me, commitment is about that. To pay attention to this stuff. Cool. More questions? Well, I'd like to hear what you all have to say. Especially the Counter-Strike players. Does this ring true to you guys? Phil and Stu, your experiences? Tell me what I might have left out. I'm sure there's parts I haven't talked about that I can't cover everything, but I'm more than happy to try.
Were there cases where the virtual friendship that came up translated into a real world friendship? I mean, maybe they met afterwards or something like that.
I think for the people that we played with, because they were on campus, most of these people,
they knew each other.
They knew each other from outside, and if they were playing on campus, they would find out a way to connect there. I think what was interesting is when I talked to the woman, and her boyfriend was also from Taiwan, and they were both Counter-Strike. In fact, the funny thing is she thought all this was garbage. When she started playing Counter, I said, man, my father and brother, they were doing these computer games for a long time. I just thought it was nonsense, a waste of time. And what happened is her boyfriend went off to Western China on an expedition somewhere, and so she was in Taiwan, and so she went to the cyber cafes and said, oh yeah, we'll teach you how to play. He says, oh yeah, fine, because she wanted to whoop his butt. That's what it came down to. And so she learned how to play. So when he came back from his expedition and said, okay, I'll play with you, he was totally shocked that she knew how to play, and she had to kind of play it down because he was like a little offended. Like, oh my God, it's like she can beat me now. It's like, uh-oh, so this whole gender, but eventually they worked it out, and so they began to both use feminist tag names on their play with people at the cyber cafes. So that was an interesting thing. But again, they were in a situation where they were in Taiwan using the cyber cafes as a vehicle for that. But they told me great stories. They would have gang members come in there, and the gang members that they knew would never play. They would always play terrorists. They would never play cops. No way. Now the gang members said, no, we're only going to play terrorists, and you don't get in their way. They're playing. It's serious. You don't get in their way. So you have to know who to not insult. Right? It becomes a key issue. So again, these cyber cafes are intimate communities that demand a certain kind of knowledge. I mean, if you're like somebody like me, and I come in, I'm an old fart with gray hair, like they don't expect you to play. But when you're talking about a youth context, it becomes much more complicated, which has to do with real life relationships, right? Mixing with virtual relationships and what that involves. I mean, people can get dissed, and they can get pretty upset. I mean, you read stories now and then of people getting like a little too upset from playing games like this, and I think that's the context not of the game. It's the context of the social world that a person brings to that game. And again, it goes back to my original point. The trick is not looking at the game per se, it's looking at the kids. It's looking at the social life. It's looking at the third spaces that may not be available. That's what's really important, I think, the significant aspect of this. The games are merely a vehicle to lay this out and show this to happen.
I think there's one area that might be interesting to explore that you might have missed out on because you were kind of working with people that mainly did the LAN game. On the internet, when people are playing in multiplayer modes, there's often a lot of clans created, so people are just getting into groups and forming kind of a regular social group of friends that kind of, I mean, there's many different aspects to explore in the clan, but I think it's very interesting, and just the clan dynamics, and different games have different types of clan behavior, like in World of Warcraft, people that are in clans, like, real life is secondary to them because they have to like. You
have to be at a certain time, right? 3 o'clock in the morning.
At a certain time, right?
Right.
But whereas like in a first-person shooter, a clan is just like you get on one server, so you just get on whenever, and as long as you're there, like.
That's right.
At least a few times a week, like your clan members still think you're cool, and then you like get together on the same team and like own a bunch of people together, and so you build more.
That's why I told Daniel why I don't play World of Warcraft. I lose all my relationships. It'd be terrible. I mean, Counter-Strike I can handle. World of Warcraft. I mean, I'm doing this for my for my class. I'm going to have my students play World of Warcraft and Counter-Strike both, and then have them keep a journal about their experiences with this. But clearly, the guild issue. We did look at the guild issue, especially in the initial study, with all the 70 servers. And I mean, they would try to recruit me as well a couple times, but I said, I don't. I mean, thank you, but no thanks. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of. Doing just an analysis of the guilds alone would be a dissertation topic in itself. I mean, I think that. I know Taylor's done work on that around the EverQuest game. I think that Castanova's done some of the work around that in his new book, Synthetic Worlds, right? Isn't that it? He's done some work around that. So there is some work being done in that area. But I think the issue of guilds and clans are an important issue to look at when you're talking about, and I think here it goes back to his point, how do these guilds and clans translate into real life communities beyond just the screen, right? How can we investigate this so we can say, okay, if you're involved in a clan, do you get together on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis? Do you, apart from the screen, are there new friendships created? I would argue that a lot of this has a lot to do with not the game. The game gives you the possibility of that, right? But what's important is the social context of the people that are involved in the game. Are they on a distant planet, right? Are they on yeah, they're that too, right? Are they in a distant country, right, where they can't physically get together? Are they down the block? I mean, I know in Chicago where I am, there's all kinds of clans that are based in Chicago that people have a chance to get if they live in the city. But if they live out in the suburbs, it may be harder for them to get together physically to do that. And also, a lot of people don't want to get together. There's also a desire for people not to know who's on the other end of that gun. They may like you in the virtual space, but that's as far as they want to take that relationship. So I think, again, it's a complex topic that it's easy to speculate about, but short of having empirical data, it's really difficult to make a judgment about that. All I can say is that the LAN group people, they weren't part of a clan; they just liked playing together. But I guess other people who would see them would think of them as a clan. Well, I don't know if that's good though. So yeah.
I think sometimes the friends you make online can be more important than those you have in real life.
Absolutely.
Especially when, if they never see your face or don't know any of the people that you know, you can tell them anything that you can't tell.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example of that. I mean, I think especially for undergraduates, right? They're just brand new to college. They're in the dorms. They don't know anybody there. You're reluctant to talk about your friends with what's going on. I mean, my own example personally is not about games, but clearly when my mother died, which was 1993. I was playing Doom that year when it came out, and I have to say I met a guy online, and he helped me through the suffering that I was having over my mom's death. Completely unbeknownst. I mean, it had nothing to do with the game. I said, "Oh man, it's like this is what's going on," and he said, "Oh yeah, I know that. I've experienced that kind of thing too." And we had this long relationship that lasted for 6 months, and I really valued that, and I've never talked with him since, And so for that brief moment. I think it's important. I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think that what I don't like is the criticism I hear even from my colleagues that somehow virtual relationships are not real. I think that's total bull. I really do. I think virtual relationships can be, like you said, more real than they're real, because it has to do not just with that person, your person, it has to do with what you get out in that relationship of the process and what that person gets out of it as well. So I think we have to expand our definition of what's real. You know, rather than this very narrow, truncated version of what's real is what's in front of your face. Well, yes and no. I mean, right, you think about that. What's real if your relatives live far away? Does that make them unreal? No, they just live in a different place, right? So what's the difference between you and a virtual friend? Now, you may not know all the things you know, but you know, in a sense, what you want in that situation, what you need to get out of it. And if they know that too, then I don't see what the problem is. You know? Cool. Good question. Yeah.
We've seen some of the same things in some of our site visits to homes. One was particularly impressive with a young kid dealing for the first time with extreme sort of prejudice, etc. He was an EverQuest player, and the EverQuest community, there was an EverQuest community that was extremely well structured and moderated. I mean, subgroups talking about how to help you with your homework, how to help you with your social life.
Absolutely.
And what was particularly moving about it was the other EverQuest players were coaching this young kid through a whole set of issues around racism, etc., that he was encountering online, and how he should respond to them, and how he, you know, his own beliefs. And it was a really very kind of mature counseling that he was getting. You know, stick by your own beliefs of egalitarianism. Don't pay attention to these other people. You're on the right track, etc., etc. And all this was totally online, and unbeknownst to his parents, who were trying to get him to stop spending so much time online.
Actually, it's really funny that you say that, because I have a really good story. I taught, they had me speak at this high school in Chicago, and it was funny because the woman who organized it was organizing it around media effects. She wanted me to talk about teens and technology. And I talked with her on the side. I said, okay, what's going on here? And she had a 15-year-old son who I think he was playing either Diablo or World of Warcraft, I'm not sure which, and she says, oh, he's just there all the time, and I can't get him to clean his room, and like, well, who can get a 15-year-old to clean their room? On and on. And so I said, what do you say to him, as your son? I said, well, I just tell him, he needs to get off the computer and do all this. I said, what is he doing? I asked her, what is he doing? And I said, why don't you ask him what he's doing on the computer? Not just playing, what is he doing in World of Warcraft? And it turns out that what the kid was doing is he was doing all this altruistic behavior, that he felt good because he was helping all these people that didn't know the game. He was exchanging, artifacts with them. I'm going, your son's like a hero. He's getting rewarded for being a good person. I said, why don't you tell him that? Why don't you tell him you love the fact that he's getting rewarded for a good person? You'd like to have him spend a little more time with you, but you should reward the fact that he's exercising what you've trained him to be, if only in virtual space. I said, my God, this is what you want. I said, why are you upset about this? And she scratched her head, going, well, you have a point there, And so she went off and she talked with him, and they had a conversation about this. And I said, look, until you are able to accept his pleasure with trying to live up to the values that you want him to live up to, he's going to resist you at every step of the way. But the minute you accept that, then he sees a reason why you should turn the computer off. Because now you've acknowledged the fact that not only is your son, but he's the good son, right? And it was kind of like, it's like a light going off. And I'm thinking, why does it take me saying this to have a light go off? It's like, it seems obvious to me. But I think that's kind of the patterns that we get into when we kind of bifurcate the virtual from the real and not see how they're interpenetrated with these different social worlds. I think that's the important thing to keep in mind around this. Had some other stuff too, but I forgot what it is. I'm kind of going brain dead here.
Game designers, and something that would be useful to the field of games would be to talk about how one would create the community that Counter-Strike has. Because that's really sort of the gold standard, is how you get millions of people playing your game and having a deep loyalty to your game. What did they do right? What problems did they avoid? Beyond the simple obvious ones. In other words, how could that success be recreated in creating the same kind
Sure.
of love and brand loyalty in other games?
Well, I think, what I always go back to is, I know this is kind of old territory, but I always go back to id Software. When they did Doom, when they released their proprietary engine on the web, I remember this. There was like, 10,000 downloads in the first 5 hours? I'm going, Jesus Christ, I've never seen this before. And, they made the software for free. Instant modification, community that emerges of making all kinds of variations of this. And yet these guys made a ton of money by releasing the commercial version of this. So I'm thinking, the more you try to hang on to the proprietary character of your investment, the more you're going to lose. Just as Apple's losing, as all the major movie companies are losing, the more you try to hang on to the, quote, intellectual property rights, the more you're going to lose it. Because what happens when you open this debate up, it's not that people necessarily want to pirate everything and pirate that. It opens up new possibilities for new developments that includes your stuff as well. It's the same thing as people say, okay, you want to download music, but people also buying CDs. Now, maybe not as many as in the past, but they're still buying it. That is, people do multiple forms of consumption. They're not just doing one narrow form of consumption. So what was brilliant about Carmack's thing with id Software was that he knew that if he just releases like 1 or 2 levels of Doom with proprietary software, that everybody and their son, uncle and son, everybody is going to buy the whole game because 1, they see the free level, right? They get to play that. 2, they get the proprietary engine where they get invested in trying to figure out how can I make a new modification. Like I told Daniel, when I got the game, I got so excited. I started putting WAD files about different sounds. So I had the Cyber Demon walking around saying "I'm not a crook" by Richard Nixon, right? And then having Beavis and Butthead sounds in there to kind of mix it up. So I think that in terms of what you're asking for is to create that, in a sense, buzz, means to create the possibilities for players to interact and create their own medium within that context. And the case, like I said, Doom is the classic example of this. I think my critique, I said this to Daniel, my critique of console games a lot is because they tend to be, quote, complete games in which you stick it in and, and then you play it and that's it. To the degree that you open up the software to allow people to modify things, gives it a pardon the expression, a half-life, a lot longer than you would if you just sold the game itself. Look at the history of Half-Life. With Counter-Strike and all the modifications that are out there, people are still buying the darn game of Half-Life. I think that's the way you make it happen, is that you create, and the community will emerge out of that investment in the modifications and in what we call the fan base, right? The fandom that happens. That's where the community is going to emerge out of. It's not something I think you can create, like if you want to go and make a community, it's something you have to create the conditions so the community can emerge from. There's no guarantee, right, that it will happen. But I know for sure, a fact, that it probably won't happen unless you allow people the opportunity to kind of engage the material, the software, right, in some form or fashion. How much, that I don't know. No. But that would be my response about that.
So basically you're saying it's a necessary but not sufficient condition.
Yeah.
But yeah, so let's just suppose I believe that.
Yeah.
Lots of games have done the same thing.
Sure.
And have not had that. So that's the thing.
So that's what I said.
As an example.
Which one?
Soldier of Fortune as an example.
That's right.
Exactly as modifiable as, say, Quake.
Right.
But not successful.
Well, I think a lot of it may have to do too with, again, like I said, it's hit and miss. It depends on when it's released. It depends on the competition in the marketplace. It depends a lot on, I asked myself, I'm going like, how come Counter-Strike is so popular? I'm going, God, man, it's pretty damn simplistic, but it's very simplicity is what makes it attractive to people. The fact that it's not about elaborateness or elaborate levels. It's very simple about you're engaged in the material, in the maps, right? Playing with other players. I think, that's a hard one. I don't know how to answer that because if I had a secret formula like that, I'd be working at Microsoft. Yeah, I think part of it's novelty.
Openness.
Well, I think, for example, Soldier of Fortune came a long way after, in a sense, it had to compete with all that genre of Counter-Strike and everything before it, so it was against a market that couldn't sustain it. That's what I would argue.
It became crowded. So.
Huh?
Essentially, your argument would then be that Counter-Strike did the right things, but did it first.
Yep, exactly.
And everyone else came into a crowded market.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think
It's the hit and missness that is the problem.
That's the problem, yes.
That game designers are trying to solve.
That's always the problem, yeah.
And so that's where, like I say, the thing that will advance the industry is to figure out how to get some sort of formulaic thing
Yeah.
that at least puts you into the lottery to be one of the hits, as opposed to a predestined miss.
I think I know more of what won't do it than what will do it. I think that's probably, you guys probably know this as well. I think about the game, for example, Stalker that came out. I love this game by these Ukrainian developers, where they're speaking in Russian. And you run around Chernobyl and you look at all the mutants being created by the second Chernobyl disaster, and you're going, whoa, this is interesting graphics, not the best, but I'm going, hey, when you see the sun change and the sun goes down, the stars come out, and it's like, the wind's blowing the trees, the leaves are blowing. It's like pretty impressive when you look at this kind of level design that's built like Grand Theft Auto. But in the case of Russian villages with Russian industrial stuff and science, and that's going to be tailored to a specific narrow niche market, right? It may not even make it that much in here, but it's definitely making a huge, huge impact in Germany. Big market in Germany for that game. And so I think that, I don't know, I don't have an easy answer for you. I think that that's kind of what market analysis has to engage in. I wish I could tell you that this could make it happen, but I don't.
I'm actually presuming you didn't
Yeah.
answer. What I'm saying is that would be an interesting area for applied work.
I agree. No, I think that's true.
From an academic perspective.
I would argue that in terms of applied work, what would be useful around that would be to think, what are, I don't mean as kids, but adults, what do people need in the culture right now? What's important for them to go away with? Part of what, I've been kind of offended by the Tom Clancy games, even though I love them all, like Ghost Recon and all that, but I get really pissed off at the politics of these things, these kind of right-wing politics that happen. I'm thinking, where's the left-wing politics? Where's the progressive games? Where's, like I told Daniel, I want to see a game with the Paris Commune, where the communards rise up against the Prussians as they try to invade Paris, and then they can, rather than be defeated, like which they were in 1848, they basically win, and they go off to take Versailles. Now, wouldn't that be an interesting alternative future that would include muskets, and Karl Marx would be there writing his field notes for his writing, and you have the prostitutes and the barriers with their red flags singing the Marseillaise. You have lots of historical opportunities for, I think, scenarios that can easily, tap into where kids are at and where adults are at too. I just think that part of it has to do with you have to take a risk. I think Carmack took a risk when he did Doom. When they moved from Wolfenstein 3D to Doom, they were taking a clear risk when they did that game. They didn't know if it was going to make it or not, but they took a risk. My God, think about it. This is Texas, and they're using Christian imagery. The crucifix upside down. If I was a developer, like a producer, I'm going, oh my God, we're going to get the whole Christian community down on our necks here. They're going to really hate us, But in fact, it became a big hit even in the Christian community, fighting the forces of Satan. So I think that what I would argue is to understand that question requires pretty extensive knowledge of the kind of community you want to reach, both sociological knowledge, cultural knowledge, political knowledge, historical knowledge, right? So you can make a judgment like, what are people responding to? What is kind of captivating their interest? We want to assume maybe it's the war on terror, right? But that's not the only thing people pay attention to. Not to say they only pay attention to, Britney Spears and all that, but, there's a lot of other variables here that can come into play about how to think about things. And I think that that's combined with good game design, good sounds, good graphics. I don't see any reason why that wouldn't go. But then the other problem you have is it's a crowded field. So you're trying to produce a game with what, think about when games were released, if I think about 1999, later on with 93, when Doom was produced, you had some games produced, but they tended to be, there was like not long development times, but enough so you had the ability to kind of differentiate. Now the market's so crowded, now with international game development, that it's very difficult, especially with the cost, as you know, producing games. It's really hard to see a hit. And my fear is the same fear I have about movies, is that developers like movie directors and producers will become more conservative because of the economic issues involved in investing in game development. And I think if you do that, that's the death knell of it. I think that's where it's both a risky proposition to do something innovative, but if you don't do it, you're going to lose. That's I'm not making you feel better. I know that, but I think that's the truth. I think that's the reality of it. And I think in terms of academic side of it, our job, what we can do, is look at the communities. Look at what's going on in the culture. find out what's happening with that. A lot of us do that anyway. If not with games, we do it in other areas as well, whether it's the inequality stuff or things like that. So I don't know if that helps, but.
Okay, I think that was a cue. So let's thank Helmut for his talk.
Thank you all. Thank you.